Hi, everybody. My name is Byron Williston, and I'm a professor of philosophy at Wilfrid Laurier University, as well as a member of the Interdisciplinary Center on Climate Change. I specialize in the ethics of climate change and have been asked by the organizers of tonight's event to say a few words about Waterloo Region's 50 by 30 initiative from this perspective. There are other speakers here who know a whole lot more than I do about the policy dimensions of the initiative, so I won't have anything to say about that. Instead, I want to explain why climate change is such a tricky ethical issue and how we can avoid some of the mental traps we get stuck in when we think about the demands it places on us. Also, I want to say why I think the 50 by 30 project is such an encouraging move in the right ethical direction. So, why is climate change an ethical problem at all, as opposed to, say, a purely scientific or policy problem? Well, ethics has to do with aiming our actions at two broad goals: harm reduction and the promotion of well-being. Ethical thinking can show us why we ought to care about these goals. Even better, it gives us conceptual tools for working through the conflicts we inevitably encounter as we pursue them. Now, nobody needs to be reminded of the serious harms and threats to well-being posed by runaway climate change. Catastrophic hurricanes, prolonged droughts, sea level rise, forced migration, and civil conflict are just some of the things that we have to look forward to, unfortunately. And no serious person doubts the main causes of all of this: profligate greenhouse gas emissions, especially from the world's richest nations. But if all of this is so clear, why don't we simply change our ways? The reason is that climate change is a particularly complicated ethical problem, and those who benefit most from carbon pollution have used this fact about it as an excuse for doing nothing and using their power to encourage others to believe that nothing can be done. As a result of this, we're stuck in a kind of gnarly mental trap. Let me explain what I mean by this with a very simple example, one meant to illustrate the basic nature or structure of moral thinking. So Jill steals Jack's bike. Here we have three clear moral elements, or elements of the moral picture: an agent of wrongdoing, a victim of that wrongdoing, and a harm. Because it's simple, we know how to repair the situation. Jill should simply give the bike back and perhaps also apologize to Jack for stealing it. Or if the bike has been damaged, she should compensate Jack for its loss in a way that he finds satisfying. Now, in real life, this simple picture gets complicated in all kinds of ways, but we always implicitly refer back to it for basic moral guidance. Climate change, unfortunately, seems to undermine the picture completely. First, carbon pollution emerges from billions of point sources, like every time you flick the switch on your gas stove. Second, its victims are spread across the whole planet, even if they're concentrated more in some places than others. They're also spread across time, right? The victims are there in the present as well as in the future. In other words, agency and harm are completely fragmented in this case. And this has allowed us the comforting thought that fixing the problem is always someone else's job. Just about every excuse that we've come up with over the past 30 years or so for essentially doing nothing about climate change exploits this fragmentation of agency. Think of the refrain we hear so often from defenders of tar sands expansion: Canada is responsible for only 2% of global emissions, so why should we act aggressively unless others do first? This waiting around for others to act is the essence of the mental trap that I've mentioned. Because, of course, virtually any single polluting group can say the same thing. The result is precisely what we have gotten from decades of international climate diplomacy: near universal inertia backed up by pointing the finger at somebody else, saying, in effect, that other guy has to act before we do. This is the path of moral laziness. It's reactive thinking, the morally corrupt excuse making of the ethical follower. You know, when Greta Thunberg exclaimed to a group of adults at the UN that if we persist in our ways, future generations will never forgive us — everybody remembers that very gripping speech, I think — she was shining a bright light on just this way of thinking. She was calling out an entire generation for refusing to take ethical leadership. How do we escape it? How do we get out of this mode of thinking? Fortunately, at the most general level, it's entirely clear what we should do: build an economy that does not require carbon pollution, and do this in a way that focuses on both enhancing everyone's lives and helping to lift up folks who are currently marginalized. I'm happy to see that those are exactly the principles underlying the 50 by 30 initiative. But I want to emphasize something else about it, namely that it's an exemplary display of moral courage and leadership. I really doubt that all those grassroots people behind the initiative could have been motivated to carry on with it for as long as they have if they'd been obsessed with what everyone else is doing. Ethical leaders simply do what needs doing, regardless of what other actors are doing. They seek coalitions of forward-thinking people, not excuses for business as usual. The 50 by 30 initiative shows us all a way out of the reactive mental trap we've been ensnared in for far too long on the most pressing concern humanity has ever faced. Let's all get behind it. Thank you.